Today, I want to talk about renting versus buying a house in the Philippines to see which makes more sense depending upon your situation and what you hope to get out of it. There's pros and cons to both, so we're going to take a look at both sides today. For the last couple of years, I've been traveling through the Philippines looking for the ideal place to live. In the beginning, I thought I'd probably have some idyllic island experience near the coast. Hearing the waves crashing and watching the sunset and getting a little bit of surf in. But it turns out of the 7,000 plus island, there's only a handful of surf spots. So easier said than done. So my expectations and probably even my priorities have changed the more that I traveled throughout the Philippines. And I really took a closer look at the ideal place to live and kind of set my priorities for that. Well, renting versus owning became part of that adventure as I tried to decide for myself what's the best option. I was used to owning property in the States and kind of had that same mentality, but not enough knowledge before I started, exploring everything, researching everything. So come along with me today as I'm going to show you actual examples of houses to rent versus houses to buy, what they cost, and the pros and cons of renting versus buying in the Philippines. It's not the same as the West. So stay tuned and make sure you're there all the way to the end, because at the end I'm going to give you a table summary of all the pros and cons of renting versus buying in the Philippines. So you'll have all that information in one place. So when you are ready to kind of consider that for yourself, you can have this information. In fact, you may want to take a picture of it or a screenshot of it in order to save this information, because this table is pretty complete. All right? So let's go ahead and jump right in with our first rental house, which also could be purchased if you wanted to, as it's in the same Royal Palm subdivision in Panglao, Bohol. I have the numbers for you today for both renting and buying the same house, since this house is available both ways. Now, this is a 3-bedroom Vista Hermosa model. And I like this model because it's very simple, very straightforward. But let me walk you through this house so you can kind of see what the footprint looks like. So this house rents for 40,000 pesos per month from this particular landlord that we're dealing with here. Plus, there's a 1,250 pesos HOA fee that usually is built into the price, but in this case, would rather have us pay it. So really, the rent is 41,250 pesos per month. Now, if I convert that to US dollars and I use a 56 exchange rate, I'm going to get $736 per month. Now, keep in mind, this is a brand new house. So that's actually probably a pretty good deal. I mean, it has new aircon, it actually has furniture and everything that you see in these images of this particular unit. But you're also going to have to cover the electricity, which is a cost factor in the Philippines because you're running the aircon. It's warm and humid every day there all year round. You're going to have to pay for water, and you're going to have to pay for the internet. So kind of adding those utilities all together, you're going to have to pay an additional 5,000 to 10,000 pesos per month, depending upon how much or how often you run the aircon. So roughly, for this particular house, you're going to be looking at about 50,000 pesos. Okay? This house is roughly just under 1,000 square feet, just for reference. All right. Now, let's look at what it would cost if we were to buy this same property. Well, the purchase price is actually 7 million pesos. Now, you're also going to have to pay a 12% VAT fee since it's a new home. So the 12% VAT off of a 7 million pesos is going to be 840,000 pesos. You can also approximate the rest of the closing costs, which is like there's a transfer tax and a stamp fee and things like that, roughly at 5%. That would be another 350,000 pesos. So if we wrap all of that up together, the total cost is going to be 8,190,000 pesos, or $146,250 using a 56 exchange rate. Now let's look at the break even on this property for buying versus renting. So if we take that total purchase price of $146,250, we'll just use US dollars. We divide it by the rent, which is $736 per month. It's going to take a total of 198, almost 199 months to break even, which is roughly 16 and a half years. It's a long time. And that assumes you paid cash and there's no loan interest to keep things simple. That's the other thing in the Philippines. It's very common to have a loan interest around 9 or 10%. It's much more than what it is in the U.S. and a lot of other Western countries. So, just as a reminder, if it's a resale home, you will not have to pay the 12% VAT tax, right? A new home, 12% VAT tax. A resale home, you don't have to pay the VAT tax. However, they have a little thing called 6% capital gains tax on resale properties, even if there hasn't been a capital gain. And in most instances, they may not have had it, and they're still going to charge you that. There's also the additional closing costs. You can figure also 5%. Okay, here's a couple things that I want you to consider. Renting is going to give you the most flexibility, and you won't have to worry about paying taxes. And if for some reason it doesn't work out, you can then move on and rent someplace else. That easy. Now, that may seem really obvious, but it's a little bit different in the Philippines. And you definitely want this important option because you're going to be exposed to certain things that you would probably not normally have to worry about in the West. For example, typhoons and earthquakes. Either one could damage the property. If you're renting, it's not your responsibility. That's something to think about. Okay, let's talk about what most landlords are going to accept. And the minimum is typically going to be a 6-month lease situation. Very few are going to go month to month. You can find month to month in some of the condos in the Panglao area, but probably not in a house, right? And if you do a 6-month option on a lease, you always want to say, I want the option to renew. And of course, the landlord would prefer a year-long lease because it gives him better stability. And but most are not going to demand that. Most will go with the 6 months. And if you do decide to go for a year, as far as the lease go, you may be able to negotiate a better price if the landlord will give you that year lease. Now, most of the time, I wouldn't recommend that. I would go 6 months to test out the area, okay? That's something we're going to talk about in a little bit, that the area, what's around you, is important, and it's different than in the West. Now, the landlord's going to require first and last payments, plus a 1-month security deposit. So you're basically looking at first, last, and security, or 3-month payments up front before you can move into the rental home. Every once in a while, if the landlord's a really nice guy and not too worried about, maybe he'll let you get away with 1 month security deposit and the first month's rent. But that's just typically not the case. You have to kind of plan that you're going to have 3 months rent, right? So in case of our first example there in Royal Palms, that Vista Hermosa house, you'd have to have 150,000 pesos up front in order to move into the house, okay? Moving on. This next rental house is also in the Panglao Bohol area. It's been refurbished, though, and it has a separate gated lot. So it's not in a subdivision. So it's a little bit different than what we just looked at before. There's pros and cons to that. But let's take a look at this next property and see what it looks like. So I really like the layout of this house, as it has more size to the rooms than most of the traditional homes in the Philippines. And it has a more open floor plan, which is something that I prefer, where your living room, dining room area going into your kitchen is basically one big great room. Hard to find in the Philippines unless you build the house yourself, but that's something that I prefer both out west and in the Philippines. Now, Philippine homes are almost always smaller than Western standards. So even a small house in the U.S. seems very large to the Filipinos. There are pros and cons to being on a separate house and lot configuration. For some, this can be a very ideal situation if the conditions are right and you don't mind being a little more, let's say, independent because you're kind of off on your own than being in a subdivision where neighbors are close by. Your experience in both situations is really going to depend upon the neighbors and any commercial type activity, retail around you, right? So noise level is a very big consideration in most places in the Philippines. If you've talked to any expat that has rented or bought over in the Philippines, they will tell you it makes a big difference who your neighbors are. For example, are you just lucky enough to have that neighbor singing Friday night till midnight or 1 a.m. in the morning, and then just to be woken up at 5 a.m. by roosters or the dogs barking, which all of the Filipinos use as their alarm systems? You just don't know until you know. So you kind of have to check things out. Now, this can also happen not just on a lot, but also in a subdivision. Your neighbors are closer by, right? So you really want to check out your surrounding neighbors at different times of the day. I'd honestly go first thing in the morning, I'd go in the afternoon, I'd go in the evening, and I'd go at night just to see how the neighbors are around you. Because I've seen a lot of different things. And you want to do that before you commit to any property. All right? Do your homework, check it out, because I've heard a lot of horror stories where someone leased a place just to find out that there's some type of automotive business or karaoke or whatever else all the time next to them, and it just made it intolerable. So noise is a real consideration in the Philippines, including street noise, right? Another thing you got to look at is the property close to a busy street. Because if it's near the highway, you're going to hear the scooters, the trikes, the trucks. And in general, Philippines is a much noisier place than in the West. In fact, some of the guys on the motorcycles kind of feel like mufflers are optional. And for some reason that I don't get, it's somehow cool to have a really loud motorcycle. I find it annoying. They find it cool. So vehicle noise can be a real concern if you're near the street. This particular house that we just looked at, it is off actually a big highway, but it's kind of offset a bit. And once you're inside the house and the doors are closed, you're actually okay. But you would always want to check that out. All right, moving on. This next house is for sale. And it's interesting as it's completely offline. It has a solar system for power and no city electric for backup. This house is in the Dawi area of Panglao and is for sale in a relatively undeveloped subdivision. Now, I have to say, I really like this house, and I have seriously considered purchasing it. And a lot of it has to do is its location and then some of the uniqueness on this house, which you're going to see in a little bit. So this is going to kind of give you an idea of what I've been looking for in the Philippines. If I could either build or rent the ideal house, this is pretty close to what I would want. And so let's take a look and you'll kind of see what I'm talking about. Now, this particular subdivision only sells lots, and then you have to go find an architect and a builder to build this custom home. They're all going to be unique. The one thing about this that makes me a little bit nervous, and one of the reasons why I did not pull the trigger, is that the subdivision has been around for maybe 10 years, but definitely has been developing for the last 5 years for sure, since about 2020. But after all of this time, there's only a handful of homes that have been built, literally probably about 4 or 5. And it's a pretty good area as far as the acreage goes. Apparently, you need to fully pay the developer for the lot before you can start building. And I think when they first did this, they actually were coming out of the COVID period. And because of that, and around the COVID period, they gave some great deals and some great terms on these lots. So I think that's probably part of it. But for now, it's a bit isolated out there. And it's great during the day. I mean, it's beautiful. And there's amazing views from the top deck, especially towards the ocean and then the hills behind it. It's almost a 360-degree view. But at night, you're very much out on your own. You're just, so it's like if anybody were to approach or whatever, there's not going to be a lot of defense. There is a guard on duty at the gate to come in, but I think they pretty much just lock the gate and then they're there on their premises just in case there's a problem. Now, you're probably wondering what's the price of this house. And the owner told me he wanted 13 million pesos. Now, you're going to need to run the power line from the electric company if you want aircon. And they've kind of gotten away without it because in the afternoon, at least half the year, there's kind of a trade wind that blows. But most of us are going to want aircon, and that's not cheap to do. So even though there is this nice breeze most days, not every day, and it's more later on in the afternoon, depending upon the time of year, of course, basically, in most of these islands, the wind blows one direction for 6 months and then reverses for the other 6 months. So for me, I guess it depends which island. I'm thinking like Negros in particular and some of the other ones like Cebu. But I would definitely want aircon. And I would do one of those split aircons, so with the units outside so you don't have to hear the noise inside, and then you have the air piece of that's actually dispensing the air in the different rooms. Now, you can expect to pay somewhere between 75,000 and 125,000 pesos for a good quality aircon unit. And you're going to need several to cool the house. Usually you put them in each bedroom. So in this case, there's 3 bedrooms. And then you're going to need a couple in the main living area because you have the kitchen and then the living room and the dining room. So I think we're looking at probably closer to at least 5 aircon units, maybe 6. So that could be an additional expense as much as like 500,000 pesos. Now that makes the price 13.5 million pesos. So here's the thing. When we talk about renting, the nice thing about renting is that it gives you a choice in order to check out the area before buying. So I would highly recommend this approach. If you have an area that you're interested in a house in, I would try to find a rental first and then check out the area, make sure it's everything that you expect, because you're really not going to fully understand an area until you actually have lived there. I can speak for myself. It took me about 60 days to really understand all the ins and outs around Panglao. And now I kind of can dial in. There are certain areas I would want to live and certain areas I would not. For example, Alana Beach is a very beautiful beach, but it's a complete tourist spot. And it's craziness down there. So I would not want to be anywhere near that area. The interesting thing is on real estate, though, the closer you are to Alana, the more expensive it is. So it's kind of this paradox. However, for me, I don't want to be near that craziness. So there's a lot of pros and cons depending upon the specific area. And within Panglao, there's certain areas I like and there's certain areas I prefer not to be. So another advantage of renting is that it's really affordable in the Philippines, especially versus buying. And then you don't have to worry about the title on the property, which can be an issue with the 40-60 law of owning land in the Philippines for foreigners, which is based upon the Philippine Constitution. It basically says that a foreigner can only own 40% of the land in order to protect the Philippine interests. So if you're married to a Filipina, she can have the 60% portion of that land under her name, and you'll have the remaining 40%. And that's typically what is done. There's one more thing that I want to talk to you about on renting versus buying. So I know all of us would like the stability to own our own home and not have payments on it if we could pay cash, right? In an ideal situation. But I'll tell you, the one thing that I'm doing personally is that I'm doing all I can to leave my money invested in the stock market so that those investments continue to grow And then when I have to, when I'm ready to start taking Social Security, I want to be able to live off of the Social Security payments and not touch those other investments so they continue to grow. So in my view of the world, as much as I like to own property, and I truly do, was raised in a family that my mom was a real estate broker in a very nice part of Los Angeles, and she was quite successful there. So it's kind of in my blood to own property. However, I feel like as you get older, 60s, I guess you could say 50s, 60s, 70s, you're better to keep your money invested in the market and then try to live off of either your pension or your Social Security or the money you're making in your job or whatever, and not touch that stuff. And then that would then parlay over into it's better to rent than to buy, because otherwise you got to pull your cash out that you could be investing in the stock market and getting a return. The stock market, depending upon what you look at, has returned between 8 and 11% per year for the last 50 years. Now, the difference is the 3% inflation. It's really returned about 11%, but you have to deduct 3% of inflation, so you say your net return is 8%. In the last 10 years, the stock market's actually even outperformed that by a couple of points. So it's just something else to think about. You're better to have the cash than having it sitting in a property. And there is always the risk that an earthquake, which there's been several lately, 7.2, 7.5, one in North Cebu, one in Davao and Mindanao. There's a known trench off of Negros Island in front of Dumaguete that also can cause earthquakes. And Bohol did have a big earthquake in 2012. And when that happened, they didn't have water or power for 90 days. So the point of all that is you're still on the ring of fire. There's a few places that the volcanoes go off. From what I understand, the Taal volcano erupted in the last week or so. And so it might be better just to rent, because then it's not your liability from all these things that could happen. Okay? Now, as promised, here is a table to highlight the pros and cons of renting versus buying a home in the Philippines. And this way you have all the information in one place. I would go ahead and either take a screenshot or a picture with your phone of that so you have that information, because there are things to consider, and title is one of them. It's a bit of a headache. Now, you can get around that if you buy a condo, and technically the law is land, right? So technically you could buy the house, but not the land. Usually that's not how it goes, though, and so you're going to be the 40% owner, and then your married Filipino is going to be a 60% owner. The other way around it is you can form a corporation, and let's say that you have 3 shareholders, and what you can do to win that game is you say like your 40% of the corporation as far as the shares go, and then make somebody else 30 and 30, or you can do 35 and 25, but you are the primary shareholder, then you have control. That's another way to do it. You'd have to go through a lawyer in Manila, but in the end, you are more protected with the corporation because you're the primary shareholder, versus if it's your Filipina, she does have 60% ownership if you're married. So those are things to kind of think about. All right, I know that's a lot. It's why it's just easier to rent. I'm telling you, it's easier to rent. And I have to tell myself that because I really want to buy one of these houses, especially that last one. Boy, I was this close. I mean, basically, 13 million pesos is roughly what? I'm doing this off the top of my head. It's around somewhere between $200, at the most, $225,000. 3 stories, on a lot, ocean view, spectacular, beautiful place. So it was really tempting to do that. Came very close to doing that. But I convinced myself I'm better leave my money in the market. The market's performing really well right now, a little bit probably too well, but I'm going with it, trying to protect myself as I go. I'm leaving my money in the market, and then I'm going to just rent for now. Okay, that's going to do it for this video. Just want to give you my 2 cents on where I'm coming from because I'm making this decision for myself. So if you've got any questions or comments on these topics, please hit me up in the comments section and kind of just let me know your thoughts. And I do my very best to respond to every comment. I appreciate you guys watching and taking the time to comment. Now, if there's anything you agree or disagree with, let me know. I want to hear your perspective. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.